So let's just start at the beginning. What's your essay about?
Our book chapter sets forth Ayn Rand's views on the nature of government and her defense and justification for capitalism, and then it burrows down into some of the specific details about her defense of property and intellectual property. And the purpose was to contextualize her views, kind of from the perspective of the Western canon, to compare and contrast her, for instance, with the natural rights philosophers, which is she's often associated with, and also to kind of compare and contrast her with some modern political movements that she's often associated with as well, such as libertarianism.
Well, I want to start by doing just that. You distinguish her from social contract theorists, and when people talk about how we should think about the purpose of government, it's, I think, very often, particularly since Ross, thought about in social contract terms. But you argue that that's not how she thought about the issue.
That's exactly correct. Or at least she didn't think of that issue in the way that it's usually conceptualized and defended in political theory today. And social contract theory, of course, goes much further back than Rawls, and even Rousseau, who it's often associated with. I mean, it really, the idea, although not the explicit term social contract, really actually begins with the natural rights philosophers in the 17th century, who conceptualized government as an agent of the people, to whom they expressly said, to whom you delegate your rights to, in exchange for the government to protect those rights. For Locke, in particular, it was very explicitly in terms of protection of your life, liberty, and property. And from this developed this foundational idea that the founding fathers even picked up on, that that there's that the basis of society is this social contract idea, that people choose to delegate their rights to the government in exchange for the protection of those rights, and the government thus is the agent of the people. The problem with this idea is this very notion of kind of delegating or transferring your rights to other people through some type of express act of consent, or even implied consent. A lot of people say, well, there never was consent, and sometimes social contract theorists then say, well, it's implied because you choose to stay in society, and thus your consent is ratified by your action, so to speak. But Rand saw consent very differently, and she's often conflated with consent theorists because she did talk about the government being an agent of the people. She even used at one point in the Nature of Government essay this phrase, you delegate your rights to the government. But she did not view consent as a literal act of consenting to the government. For her perspective, consent was not an action or a choice of, I am agreeing to this particular institution. Instead, to Rand, consent was a moral act. And the moral act was consenting to the respect for individual rights. And recognition of the respect of individual rights is that this requires an institution like the government to secure those rights, both your own and other people, so that we can ultimately have a flourishing and successful society.
We've talked about Rand's view of rights on the podcast before, but if you could just say briefly what she thinks is the role of government and its relationship to her view of rights, to set some context.
So for Rand, a right is a principle that defines and sanctions the freedom of action in a social context. That's her definition of an individual right, and it's a very important definition. For Rand, as we point out in our chapter, definitions are not stipulative, nor they are merely conventional. They are essential to the objective identification of facts in the world. And the facts in the world that give rise to the need for the concept of rights in this instance is that individuals need to be left free in order to think and to act upon their thoughts in order to produce the goods necessary for themselves to live and to have ultimately flourishing lives. And for Rand, therefore, rights are kind of the foundational moral standard by which you assess whether a society is actually a moral society or not. And in fact, she famously said individual rights are the means of subordinating society to moral law, because it's the concept of rights as a moral concept by which you can then assess that the government is doing its job and that individuals are being left free to live rational, productive, happy lives. And in this respect, this is why she also very much admired the natural rights philosophers and the founding fathers, and in particular the United States of America, because the United States of America was a tremendous historical achievement, because it was the very first country that was expressly founded upon the principle of individual rights as enunciated in the Declaration of Independence. Despite even some minor errors in that document, I mean, what a tremendous human accomplishment, the statement that all governments are instituted among men for the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So I want to talk mostly about her view of property rights, but there's one issue that you touched on that I think I certainly hear a lot when I speak to younger people interested in free market ideas. So Rand thinks that because we want to protect individual rights, a government is necessary, and yet anarchism has become very popular. So what is her view of why you need a government, and why this idea of no government or competing governments or competing protection agencies is off the table for her?
Right, that's an excellent question, and because you're exactly correct. This idea of anarchism has really kind of taken over, and has come to really define many libertarian scholars and many people on what is defined as the political right today, and she deeply and vehemently rejected the idea of anarchism, and was an ardent defender of the objective necessity and validity of having a government. A government which she defined as an institution that enforced social rules within a specific geographic context. Now, we normally think of governments in the context, for instance, of punishing criminals and preventing people from deliberately infringing our rights, the murderers, the thieves, the type of people who typically exemplify the examples we talk about when we talk about the need for government. And that is certainly the case. You need an institution like a government that wields a monopoly on the use of force within a particular geographic area to address effectively those types of individuals. But more importantly, there's a justification for government that's often forgotten or not paid attention to by libertarians and by people who would normally be our allies politically. And that is, government is a necessity not just for punishing immoral people and bad people who would violate our rights. It's a necessity for good people. So Rand rejected the cynical view of Thomas Hobbes, and even sometimes of the founders who thought, it's because people have, irrational impulses or there are bad people. This is why we need governments. James Madison famously said in the Federalist Papers, if all men were angels, government would not be necessary. And Rand did not agree with that. She said, even if all men were angels, she didn't literally say this, men would still need government. We would still need government to define the basic social rules by which we would be interacting with in society. And that is because even if we were fully rational, every person in society, we are not infallible. And there are legitimate, honest mistakes between fully rational, good people. And how will those mistakes be adjudicated? You can have entirely legitimate, good business persons enter into a contract and end up in a disagreement over the terms of those contracts, each of them legitimately thinking they're correct. And you need a government that has objective, set forth rules. Everyone knows beforehand, what's required for evidence, what are the standards, to then adjudicate those types of disputes between good people such that they can then resolve those disputes peacefully and move on to continue with engaging in productive interactions and living successful lives. And, we experience this every day in our lives. We experience disputes between friends. We experience, the disputes between neighbors where they each are accusing each other of trespassing on their property. And these people, your friend is not a vicious, immoral person. The neighbors are not vicious, immoral people. These are good people. These disputes are just naturally part of what happens when people are not infallible, and when people even can be fully rational. And you need to have beforehand a government, a neutral arbitrator, to set forth objectively what are the standards by which we're going to assess these disputes and how are we going to resolve them in order for them to be resolved peacefully. And that is the baseline for having peaceful, cooperative interactions in society, that people know that there is an arbiter for those types of disputes.
Yeah, I mean, we both know that, of course, the anarchists, they'll have answers to that and all sorts of objections. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole now. I do want to encourage, I think I'd like to see objectivists write on this more, because I do think that there are some complex arguments that particularly are confusing to younger people. So anybody out there who has some free time.
Yeah, no, I entirely agree. I mean, so I wanted to kind of hit on the primary point, because then, for instance, some libertarian economists say, yes, but the whole point is that people, they interact voluntarily through contracts, so they should be able to do the same thing with respect to governments. They should be able to choose between competing governments, and and they should go with the one that could best and most efficiently resolve the disputes that they might have and enforce their contracts. And Rand addressed each of those kind of response arguments, and we detail those responses in our chapter. The problem with that argument as a derivative argument is that it conflates what she would call, the power of the dollar with the power of the gun. It conflates what is inherently a coercive institution that wields force as a retaliatory measure, which is government, with what inherently is a cooperative, explanatory, rational, reason-based institution, which can't compel you to do anything against your will, can only convince you through your use of your mind, a business. And so, there are certainly derivative issues and further arguments, but I just kind of wanted to lay that kind of baseline that it's government that makes possible, from Rand's perspective, peaceful, ongoing, cooperative, flourishing interactions in society. It's not just about stopping bad people. It is about actually creating the base conditions for even having good people being able to do what they want to do and interact with each other in the world.
So I want to talk a little bit about Ayn Rand's view of property rights, which are really central to how she thinks about rights and the role of government. But I want to back into it with a perspective that's very widespread, particularly on the left today. And there's a view that, property rights are a legal convention, and since the government could have set up and defined rights in various ways, we can't claim to have a right to property prior to government that it has to recognize and protect. And so if it sets up, a situation that involves, a large welfare state or things like that, there's no moral complaint that you can make. The only complaint is the government obeying the rules as it's been set up? And I wonder if you can contrast that sort of view with how Ayn Rand thinks about it, because I think she takes a radically different approach to thinking about property rights.
Oh, exactly. Completely radically different approach, both kind of methodologically and substantively. And this is the ways in which Rand shared some common ideas and ideals with the natural rights philosophers and the founding fathers who were informed by natural rights in creating the United States of America, is that instead of kind of starting from this kind of consent-based assumption about, we formed society and government is now doing things according to consent of the majority, she rejected that type of kind of generalized intuition-based approach. She said, you always have to check your premises. It's her famous phrase. You have to ask, kind of get down to the foundational question, which is, why do we have rights? What are rights? What is their origin? And what's the function, for instance, of the right to property? And so she viewed property in particular as a fundamental right, that she viewed it very much as a logical byproduct of your right to your life. And so she viewed it as a necessary, as I said, it's a necessary byproduct of what it means to live your life. So it's not something that arises simply because we have a government who's protecting us and is defining something that it's calling property. In fact, it's because of our very nature as rational animals that we actually have to create property, and then when we interact with people in society, we have to be left free to create that property and then to be able to use it to sustain our lives by disposing of it in consensual interactions with other people through things like contract. And so she follows a similar methodology as the natural rights philosophers in the 17th and 18th centuries, where she actually says, so you actually have the right to life. And what does it mean for humans to have a right to life? And it means that you have to be left free to take the actions necessary to sustain your life. Life, for Rand, is a process of acquiring and using values that, and acquiring, it means for humans creating values, because we don't find for ourselves ready-made the products necessary to sustain us. We don't go into the woods and find clothes and homes and cars and air conditioners. Or computers or telephones for that matter. So humans actually have to think about what we need to do in order to sustain ourselves. So it's not even a process of identifying like what food is important for us, what things to avoid, like the poisonous berries. You also have to acquire the methods. You have to think about the methods of farming and the methods of creating tools to farm, creating plows and how to use plows properly. And all of that is rational thought combined with the action that follows from that rational thought and guided by the rational thought in creating the values necessary to sustain yourself, the food and shelter and clothing, the basic necessities, and then, of course, the more important things that are part of living a full, flourishing human rational life, like art and things of that sort. And so to have the freedom to create those things means you also have to have liberty. You have to have the right to liberty. So a right to life by necessity means a right to liberty. And then acting upon the right to life and liberty, you're actually creating these new values. You're creating a farm. You're going out and finding fallow land, and you're inventing a plow, and you're plowing the soil, and you're building your home. So you're actually creating values in the world that didn't exist before. In other words, property. And the freedom to create those values, acting upon your right to life and liberty, is, for Rand, the right to property. It's why she thus defined the right to property as the right to acquire, use, and dispose of material values. So she has a very detailed philosophical justification for property as how it flows out of the very requirements of human nature as a rational animal. And thus, when you enter into society and are secured the freedom of sphere of action to continue to create those values, it's a proper and just government that then recognizes and secures those rights to you. It doesn't create those rights.
I want to read a quote from your paper that the first time I read it, I think my jaw fell to the floor because it was so surprising and yet such a fertile thought. So, quote, significantly, Rand is not saying that the right to property is a moral claim to an object. As an individual right, the right to property secures only freedom of action in a social context, unquote. What are you getting at in that section of your chapter?
Oh, it's a very important point that is, and it's a point of confusion between Rand and, for instance, the natural rights philosophers, and it's one of the points where she diverges from them, given her many more substantive and fundamental differences in some of her in her epistemology and metaphysics. And for her, rights are not inherent in humans. So she rejected intrinsicism in epistemology, this idea that concepts and principles and things existed in nature. And so rights were not intrinsic either in humans directly as parts of us, nor were they intrinsic in objects in the world. What a right is, as I stated earlier, as she defined it, is a moral principle defining and sanctioning man's freedom of action in the social context. So what a right was a moral principle that we induced from the recognition of the facts of human nature, that humans have to be left free to think and to be able to produce the values necessary to sustain our lives and ultimately live flourishing lives. And this is why she says rights both define and sanction. So they define that descriptively the scope of that freedom, and they validate it. They say it's legitimate because we should have that freedom, because if we don't, we cannot survive, we cannot live, we cannot have flourishing lives. And in fact, the 20th century is a testament to of government after government, the Soviet Union, the Khmer Rouge, the Nazi Germany, even even the Taliban and Ayn Rand dictators now, of governments that exemplified what it means for governments not to respect what an individual right is. So it's a moral principle that recognizes a sphere of action that you have the liberty to take that action without being coerced or compelled through coercion by other people in society, so that you can actually live a flourishing life. So a right to property is not I have a right in a thing. It's I have the liberty to use something that I've created, and to use it for the benefit of my life. And in a more advanced, complex society like we have today, that means engaging in contracts and other commercial exchanges. But at root, even in advanced commercial societies like we have today, they ultimately go back to an initial act of production that was an act taken in a social context that was defined and secured to that person, or should have been, as an individual right.
I wonder if you could contrast then her view of property rights from, I think, particularly among free market leaning economists, that the source of property rights is really about solving the problem of scarcity. That is, people have unlimited wants, and yet we have limited things, and so we need property to define property rights in order to deal with that conflict.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and that's a very common argument that one hears, especially from economists who are advocates for the free markets, that property is the solution to conflicts about scarce goods. And Rand rejected the concept of scarcity, both kind of as a foundational concept for assessing how we should frame and define what rights are. But she rejected the concept more fundamentally of scarcity as just an invalid concept. I mean, and for two reasons, and I think that this is very significant. The first is that scarcity is a concept that really reflects what Rand called the primacy of consciousness, because scarcity starts in the premise we have unlimited wants, and there's only so many things in the world that can satisfy those wants. And so it has this so it starts from the premise of what our desires are, not from what are the facts of the world and what is actually the facts of human nature. I mean, so it takes as a given our desires without actually assessing, well, are those desires rational or irrational, and why would we have these desires? Those are the more kind of fundamental questions in epistemology and metaphysics and and about human nature more generally that Rand says you have to first assess. And scarcity, assumes as a baseline, no, just whatever we have in our head is all of these unlimited wants. We all want 10,000 Ferraris, and we all want 10,000 awesome steaks and things of that sort. And there's not that many Ferraris, there's not many steaks. So now we have conflicts over resources as the baseline. But there's also another reason to reject the concept of scarcity outside of kind of this more fundamental kind of conceptual point. That's an invalid concept. Rooted in an invalid conception from metaphysics and epistemology, and that is that it takes it starts from the wrong baseline. And again, Rand's response to free market economists would be check your premises, right? So you say there's scarcity, there's conflicts over these goods, and her immediate question is, well, where did these goods come from? How did we get these goods in the first place? Because as I mentioned earlier in our call, you don't go out into the woods and find just ready-made for us homes and clothing and air conditioners and laptop computers and Ferraris and things of that sort. These things have to be produced. They have to be created. And even before that, they had to be thought of as values that we should pursue and create in order to live flourishing lives. And I mean, the best example that I kind of use, I think illustrates this, is that, there was no conflict over the oil that was literally seeping up from the ground in Pennsylvania for hundreds and hundreds of years. No one was fighting over that oil. That oil only became a valued resource when humans invented combustion engines. And they discovered that oil could be used as a lubricant, but more importantly, oil could be converted into gasoline to run those engines. And so it was the human capacity for innovation, for invention and production, which then converts kind of facts of the world into values. And humans who create those values, that's their property. Right? And they have the right to that property. And if other people are entering into conflict with them, that's not the baseline to which you start. That's not where then we say, well, now we need property. No, you have property, and you have the right to property, the freedom to be secure against coercion from other people who may want that. And if they do want it, they need to enter into contractual exchange with you. They can't just take it. So. To start the whole discussion of property, or even rights more generally, from this notion of scarcity, really represents kind of the exact kind of confused, intuition-based approach to thinking about political theory that Rand really rebelled against as causing a lot of the problems we have today. That people kind of start with later derivative concepts without realizing where those concepts come from and what they really mean, and that we really need to ask the more fundamental questions. We need to check our premises. And this is why she repeatedly emphasized that, politics in particular is not a primary. It follows from more fundamental concepts in ethics and in metaphysics and epistemology.
Yeah, it strikes me that there's a connection between this point and a lot of the way that we're taught to think about the welfare state, about the inequality issue. So one aspect of those issues is morality, but another is just this perspective that our primary is people have desires. How do we maximize their getting what they want? And
right.
And her perspective is we have requirements as human beings, and we have to take certain actions to get them. And if you take those actions, then you have a right to the result. And so it's a completely different perspective that then kind of underlies her moral outlook.
Right, exactly. And it really reflects in how you just described that. I think captures perfectly the radical nature of her thought that I think a lot of people miss. When people first read Ayn Rand and they get very excited, and usually politics is the entry point for a lot of people starting to read Ayn Rand and admiring her. And it certainly is the basis by which a lot of people talk about her today. And to do that, I mean, she certainly had important insights in politics, but it misses the very radical nature of her, the very methodology of her approach, which is what produced those insights that makes her so beloved by many people today and hated by other people for all the right reasons that they hate her.
One other major topic I want to touch on that you spend time on in the essay is her view of intellectual property. And I think having talked about scarcity leads right into the fact that by many people who claim to support free markets, there's a growing, I think, opposition to intellectual property rights, often based on this idea of, well, since property rights are rooted in scarcity and here's a place where there's no scarcity, we should do away with intellectual property rights. What was her view of intellectual property rights and how they related to property rights more broadly?
Right. Yes. I mean, Ayn Rand is very unique today among thinkers who defend the free market in her strident defense and belief in the importance and propriety of intellectual property. And it's one of the kind of, I think, the most important points of contrast that between her and many contemporary libertarians and advocates for the free market who do so from more of an economic framework. And it comes out of their view comes out of what you just referred to as, they say, if you see scarcity as the baseline for why we have property rights, then that's going to inexorably lead to the conclusion that intellectual property is not a valid property right, because the one thing that is not scarce by the terms of that definition, economics, it's non-rival or it's non-exhaustive, is a new invention or a new creation of a book, because these things can be copied, and can be copied without exhausting the initial copy, and different people can use the copies at different times without being in conflict with each other. And And Rand had a very different view of intellectual property, which followed from her actual view of property. So she doesn't even view intellectual property as kind of a unique or unusual or derivative type of property. She actually said at one point in her essay on patents and copyrights, which is this short little 2.5-page essay that's been reprinted in Capitalism and Ideal, that that patents represent kind of the heart and core of property rights. And the reason why she said that is because she came to recognize intellectual property as a key, essential type of property in this respect, because she saw all property, as I described earlier, as ultimately flowing from the productive activities that are based in the rational mind. So, as I mentioned earlier, humans do not come into the world like other animals, and we know automatically what berries to eat or not to eat, or how to make steaks, or how to grow how to grow corn, and how to raise cattle properly, how to build homes. We not only have to think about these values and pursue them. And in most of human history, we didn't have these values, or these values were not ready available as they are today. So these really were things that had to be thought about and very hard in how to acquire them for thousands of years. But we also have to even come up with the methods for how to do so. As I mentioned earlier, the methods of husbandry, of farming, the method inventing the machines like the plow and the tractor and things of that sort. And so she saw the root of property as fundamentally being intellectual, not just intellectual property in the sense of patents and copyrights, but all property as being fundamentally intellectual, that all of it arose ultimately from man's rational faculty and his need to exercise that faculty, and then engaging in the virtue of productivity, which is one of the 7 primary virtues in our ethical theory, in producing the values necessary for us to live and to have flourishing lives. And thus, she induces from her conception of human nature and what that means for property to recognize also that intellectual property, which is often either viewed as the special hard case of property, or it's viewed as illegitimate monopoly and not even a property at all, as actually representing a key type of exemplar property. In fact, she said, intellectual property secures the base of all property rights, the products of man's mind. And I don't think, for instance, it was an accident, and it certainly wasn't an accident, given this view that Rand had, that all of her heroes are creators and inventors. Howard Rourke, the architect, John Galt, the inventor, Richard Haley, the composer. These are people who are exercising their rational minds to come up with new creative works and new innovative technologies, and because that is what exemplifies ultimately what it means to be human.
So I'm going to give you a choice of questions here. Either, what do you think is the biggest misconception or misunderstanding about Rand's political theory? Or if you don't have anything interesting to say on that, is there anything that you learned in working on this chapter? Those are both equally great questions. So I very much feel torn between which one should I answer. You have total permission to do both if you want.
Yes, I think one of the I'll start with the second question. One of the things that really kind of was brought home again to me in writing this chapter with Fred Miller, and it really was a joy and an honor to co-author this chapter with Fred Miller, who is just such an important, profound political philosopher and historian of philosophy in his own right, is the kind of the radical nature of Rand's philosophy again, in both kind of method and substance. And, at every point in which you are, at every point in which we were describing Rand's thought, and it was hard because we were describing kind of derivative points, so we kept having to say, well, this presupposes a more fundamental point in her ethics, right? Or this presupposes a more fundamental point in her view of human nature. That it really drove home that when people misunderstand her and criticize her, it's very oftentimes because they don't actually fully appreciate and or understand themselves kind of the radical nature by which she thought about these issues, and the methods of thinking and the way in which she drew from more fundamental concepts, follow on observations, induced further observations, and therefore then reform and formulated additional concepts based upon the more fundamental principles with additional observations, coming up with those additional concepts and follow on principles. And so this really was brought home for me in the portion of the chapter where we talked about her discussion of that there's no conflicts of men's interests, where she says between rational men in a free society there's no conflicts of men's interests, and this is a really serious, important point, and it's hard to understand if you don't fully understand Rand's full theory of what it means for humans to be rational, what it means to live in a free society, and how those principles then are applied ultimately in the context of a free society that secures individual rights. And I think that's ultimately so one of the general points of the misunderstandings of Rand is that a lot of people do come to Rand through her politics. In fact, she is invoked very oftentimes in today's kind of more general debates in the media and on television and political contexts, and a lot of the time it's people misunderstand ultimately what she was trying to achieve or what she was saying, because they are taking a particular sentence or a particular paragraph or even a particular idea out of its kind of philosophical framework in which she derived that idea. And so, of course, you can reach what sound to be very absurd conclusions if you take anyone's ideas out of their context. And so, I really think it's important to always remember, that Rand very much was followed in kind of a much older philosophical tradition where philosophers formulated full, complete philosophic systems of metaphysics and epistemology and politics, ethics and politics, and that you really have to understand how the later derivative ideas in ethics and politics follow from the more fundamental ideas in order to fully appreciate and understand them. Certainly one can potentially one could disagree with them, but one should disagree with what Rand really thought, not what one thinks when Rand thought when one takes a particular idea out of its context.
Yeah, which leads me to my last question. So, one of the strengths of the companion to Ayn Rand is that although it's not a systematic treatment of every one of her ideas, it does present the overall picture of her entire thought. And so, like, even within your piece, there's references, throughout the book where people can get a deeper explanation of, what Rand means by intrinsic or of her view of human nature. Can you say a little bit from your perspective of why you think this book is important?
So as an academic, I think this book is extremely important because it does present in a single monograph Rand's ideas in context, because there have been prior works that have presented Rand's ideas, such as Dr. Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, which is an incredible work and a monumental achievement on its own terms. But this work does something slightly different, which is that it doesn't just kind of systematically present Rand's ideas. It presents those ideas in the context of other philosophers, both in the past and present, philosophical ideas and movements that she is associated with or contrasted against. And so for academics and students who are truly trying to understand, through Ayn Rand's terms from her epistemology, to differentiation and then integration, differentiating something against something else and then being able to integrate it into what something is. Our chapter, for instance, presents some of those contrasts that are very important. For instance, the contrast of Rand with natural rights philosophers, with whom she is often associated with, and explaining why, yes, she shared some ideas, which is why she's associated with them. She shared some ideas with them, and in a certain sense, they're fellow travelers in political theory, but they also had some fundamental disagreements, and those disagreements are significant and important because they have implications for the ideas in politics. The contrast with libertarianism and why she rejected libertarianism, and so. I think it's a very important work because it will finally, for a lot of academics and students who are coming to Rand and are studying her in college and in graduate school, it will finally help them start to understand a little bit better, how she fits in the Western canon and what were actually her original contributions and in what areas she was similar to other philosophers and important thinkers.
My guest today has been Adam Mossoff.
Well, thank you, Don. This was really great. I appreciate it.